Teams argue longest about the smallest decisions. Every manager has watched it happen. A 5-minute budget item sails through without a single question. Then, someone brings up the color of the break room walls, and the meeting doesn't end for an hour. This isn't bad luck. It has a name. Psychologists and engineers call it the Law of Triviality. Most people know it by a friendlier nickname, bikeshedding. The idea comes from a classic thought experiment about a committee reviewing plans for a nuclear power plant. The committee's job is to approve 3 things: the reactor design, the safety fencing, and a bike shed for employees to store their bicycles. You'd expect the reactor design to trigger the longest debate. It's the most complex, the most expensive, and by far the most consequential item on the agenda. Instead, the opposite happens. The reactor gets rubber-stamped in minutes. Almost nobody in the room feels qualified to challenge the engineering. They defer to the experts and move on. Then the committee reaches the bike shed. Suddenly, everyone has something to say. Should the roof be flat or sloped? What color should the paint be? Should there be room for 20 bikes or 30? The meeting explodes into debate. An issue that barely matters ends up eating more time than the issue that matters most. This story comes from the writer C. Northcote Parkinson, who described it in the late 1950s as part of his broader writing on how committees and bureaucracies actually behave, as opposed to how they're supposed to behave on paper. He wasn't writing about a real power plant. He was pointing at a pattern he saw everywhere, in government, in business, in any group of people handed a shared decision. Decades later, software engineers picked up the same idea and gave it a nickname that stuck even harder than the original term. They called it bike shedding and used it to describe exactly this pattern showing up in code reviews. A proposal to rewrite a core piece of infrastructure sails through with a quick nod, because only a few engineers in the room truly understand the trade-offs well enough to argue. A proposal to rename a variable, or pick a naming convention, can consume days of back-and-forth comments, because literally everyone reading the code has an opinion and zero risk in sharing it. Why does this happen? The answer isn't complicated once you see it. Confidence, not importance, drives participation. Reactor physics is intimidating. Nobody wants to sound foolish arguing about neutron flux in front of colleagues, so the room stays quiet and defers. Paint color is different. Everybody has opinions about paint color. There's no expertise required, no risk of embarrassment, and no reason to hold back. So everyone jumps in, and the discussion sprawls. This is the core mechanism, and it's worth sitting with for a second. It isn't that people care more about trivial things. It's that trivial things are safe to have opinions about. High stakes, technical decisions carry social risk. Saying the wrong thing about a nuclear reactor in front of engineers feels dangerous. Saying the wrong thing about paint color feels harmless, even if you're actually wrong. So the low-risk topic absorbs all the energy in the room, while the high-risk, high-value topic gets waved through. Think about what's actually happening to each person's ego in that room. On the reactor question, speaking up risks looking incompetent in front of people who genuinely know more. The downside of staying silent is small, and the downside of speaking up badly is large. On the paint color question, that math flips completely. There's no expert in the room to embarrass you, so the downside of speaking up drops close to zero, while the upside, feeling heard, feeling involved, feeling like your taste counts for something, stays exactly the same. Every person in that meeting is running this calculation instantly and unconsciously, dozens of times an hour, without ever framing it as a calculation at all. It just feels like caring more about the bike shed. It isn't. It's a rational response to where the social risk sits. This happens constantly inside real companies, and it rarely looks as obvious as a bike shed. $1 million vendor contract can get approved with barely a question because most people in the room don't have the financial or legal background to poke holes in it. And nobody wants to be the person who slows down a deal by asking a question that reveals they don't fully understand the terms. Meanwhile, a new font for the internal newsletter can turn into a week-long email thread because literally everyone has an opinion about fonts, and there's zero social cost to sharing it. Think about how often this plays out in slightly different clothes. A software team ships a major architectural decision after one short conversation, because only 2 people in the room actually understand distributed systems well enough to argue about it. Then the same team spends 3 meetings debating what to name a Slack channel. A finance team approves a large capital expenditure quickly, trusting the numbers from the person who built the model, then spends an entire afternoon arguing about which conference room to book for the quarterly review. None of this means the team is dysfunctional. It means the team is human, and humans engage where they feel safe, not necessarily where the stakes are highest. Marketing teams see their own version constantly. A campaign budget gets signed off in a single glance because the numbers came from someone trusted with the modeling. The exact shade of blue on a landing page becomes a running debate that outlives the campaign itself. Sales teams do it too. A pricing structure that will affect margin for the next 2 years gets approved with a nod because pricing strategy sounds technical and nobody wants to be the person who admits they don't fully follow the model. Meanwhile, the wording on a follow-up email template gets rewritten by 6 different people before anyone hits send. HR teams aren't immune either. A restructuring plan that will reshape reporting lines for dozens of people can move through leadership quickly, almost quietly, while the phrasing of an internal survey question gets debated for a full hour. In every one of these cases, the pattern is identical. Confidence, not consequence, decides where the conversation lands. Remote and hybrid work has made this worse in a specific, easy-to-miss way. A quick Slack thread costs almost nothing to join. Anyone can drop a 1-line opinion about font choice between other tasks without ever needing to fully engage with the topic. That same low-friction channel rarely gets used to seriously challenge a technical roadmap because a half-formed technical objection typed quickly into a chat window feels exposed in a way a throwaway opinion about color never does. The lower the cost of participating, the more a topic invites participation regardless of whether it deserves it. Trivial decisions are, almost by definition, the cheapest topics to have an opinion about, which is exactly why chat tools amplify the bias instead of reducing it. It helps to think of meeting time as a limited resource, like a budget you have to spend somewhere. If nobody actively manages where that time goes, it doesn't flow toward the most important topics by default. It flows toward the topics where everyone feels equally entitled to have an opinion, because those are the ones where participation feels free and low risk. Left alone, a meeting's clock behaves less like a rational allocator and more like water finding the easiest path downhill. It pools wherever resistance is lowest, not wherever the value is highest. There's a useful analogy here. Picture a classroom where the teacher asks a hard calculus question and then a simple spelling question back to back. Almost nobody raises a hand for the calculus problem because getting it wrong in front of the class feels risky. Hands shoot up for the spelling word because everyone feels confident enough to answer without embarrassment. The classroom doesn't spend more time on spelling because spelling matters more. It spends more time there because the participation barrier is lower. Meetings work exactly the same way, just with adults and slightly higher stakes. Here's the part nobody expects, and it's the part that actually changes how you should run meetings. The instinct is to tell people to stop caring so much about small stuff, to just get over the paint color and move on to the real issues. That instinct is wrong, and it usually backfires. Telling people to stop engaging with trivial topics doesn't fix anything, because the underlying reason they're engaging hasn't changed. They're not choosing paint color over reactor design because they're shallow. They're choosing it because it's the only topic in the room where their voice feels welcome and safe. Shame people out of that, and you don't get better meetings. You get quieter ones, where people disengage from small decisions without becoming any more willing to speak up on the big ones. The actual fix isn't about changing how people feel, it's about changing how decisions are routed before the meeting even starts. This is the sharper, less comfortable point buried inside the whole idea. Bike shedding isn't really a communication problem. It's a structural design flaw in how the agenda hands out authority. If a decision requires no expertise and low risk, it shouldn't be sitting on a group agenda in the first place, no matter how democratic that feels. Democracy on trivial matters is expensive theater. It looks inclusive, but it quietly taxes the group's most limited resource, which is shared attention, and it does that on the topics least deserving of it. Here's the contrarian piece worth saying out loud, because most advice on this topic gets it backwards. Bike shedding usually gets treated as a discipline problem, as if the fix is simply telling people to care about the right things. That framing blames the wrong party. A room full of people eagerly debating paint color is often a room where people actually feel safe enough to speak at all, which is not nothing. The failure isn't that they're willing to talk. The failure is that nobody designed the agenda to point that willingness at the topics where it would actually help. Punishing engagement on small topics doesn't create engagement on big ones. It just teaches people that speaking up, in general, isn't worth the risk, and that lesson generalizes in exactly the wrong direction. So what does a manager actually do with this? Start by sorting decisions before they ever reach a meeting, not during it. Put trivial decisions on a fast track. One accountable person decides, without convening a group vote, paint color, font choice, which vendor handles the office snacks, the exact wording of an internal Slack channel name. These don't need a room full of people weighing in. They need one person with the authority to just decide and move on. Reserve group discussion time for decisions where real expertise matters and genuine disagreement adds value. That's the whole point of a group discussion in the first place. To surface expertise the room doesn't uniformly share, and to stress test an idea from angles a single decision-maker might miss. A reactor design benefits from group scrutiny, assuming the group actually has the expertise to scrutinize it. A wall color does not, no matter how many people have feelings about beige versus gray. It also helps to name, out loud, who actually owns each type of decision before the meeting starts, not as a bureaucratic exercise, but as a short, plain statement attached to the agenda itself. This item is a fast-track call, owned by one name, no vote needed. This item is a group decision, because the room genuinely holds relevant expertise the owner doesn't have alone. Just labeling the two categories differently changes how people show up. Nobody spends energy fighting for a vote on something explicitly marked as already decided by one accountable owner, and nobody assumes silence equals agreement on something explicitly marked as open for real debate. The label does a surprising amount of the work before a single word of discussion even happens. It's also worth giving equal weight to the flip side of this fix, because managers sometimes overcorrect. Fast-tracking trivial decisions doesn't mean shutting down every stray comment about the small stuff forever. Occasionally, letting a team spend 5 relaxed minutes on something low stakes can be healthy, a bit of shared, low-pressure conversation that costs little and builds rapport. The problem was never that people enjoyed talking about the bike shed. The problem is a full hour vanishing into it, while the reactor design waits in the wings, unexamined, simply because nobody structured the room to protect that time in the first place. There's a simple diagnostic worth using in real time. If a meeting is spending more time on the coffee machine than the budget, that's not a coincidence. It's a predictable bias, playing out exactly the way the law of triviality predicts. The moment you notice it happening, that's your cue to intervene, not to shame the room into silence, but to physically remove the trivial item from the agenda and hand it to one person to decide offline. Route small decisions around the room entirely. Don't ask for a vote on things that don't require one, and protect the discussion time you do have for the choices that actually move the business forward. Every minute spent debating carpet samples is a minute not spent stress testing a strategy, reviewing a risky commitment, or catching a flaw in a plan before it becomes expensive. A genuinely useful test for sorting decisions is to ask whether the debate would still matter in a year. Will anyone remember, or care, what color the bike shed ended up being painted? Almost certainly not. Will anyone remember whether the reactor design was sound? Absolutely, because the consequences compound over time. In a way, paint color never will. If the answer is no, the decision belongs on the fast track, made by one accountable person, not litigated by committee. This test works because it forces a proxy for stakes that doesn't require deep domain expertise to apply. You don't need to understand distributed systems, reactor physics, or contract law to ask whether something will matter in 12 months. Anyone in the room can apply it, which makes it a rare tool that's both simple and genuinely effective at catching bike shedding before it eats another hour. It's worth noticing how little this test actually asks of anyone. It doesn't require a manager to be the smartest person in the room or to have read every study on group psychology. It just requires someone willing to interrupt a debate and ask one plain question out loud. Will this matter in a year? That single sentence, said at the right moment, does more to fix a runaway meeting than any lecture about staying focused ever will, because it reframes the debate around stakes instead of opinions. And stakes are much harder to argue about endlessly than taste. None of this means trivial decisions deserve no thought at all, or that group input is inherently wasteful. The point isn't that small decisions don't matter even a little. It's that they don't matter enough to justify the shared, expensive cost of a full group's attention. A single accountable person picking a paint color thoughtfully, quickly, and without a vote still produces a perfectly good outcome, usually just as good as the one the committee would have reached after an hour of debate, except now that hour is available for something that actually needed it. So the next time a meeting seems to be dragging on a decision that feels oddly small, don't assume the team is being petty or difficult. Recognize the pattern for what it is. People are engaging where they feel confident, not necessarily where the stakes are highest. And left unmanaged, that instinct will always pull the room toward the bike shed and away from the reactor. Follow for more management theories explained simply. The practical takeaway is straightforward. Route trivial calls to one accountable person on a fast track and save the room's collective time and attention for the decisions where expertise and disagreement genuinely earn their keep. Do that consistently, and your team will stop arguing longest about the smallest decisions and start spending its meeting time on the choices that actually move the business forward.